And if you're not quite sure what Kathy wrote there, you and she can figure it out.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. So we had a great conversation around ecological economics. As always, Trevor gave a great foundation piece for us. And there was a lot of conversation around, what does that mean in today's day and age? So as you can see, the conversation focused around, how do we dethrone, the current economic capital and sort of the mechanisms and philosophies surrounding that. Trevor had some great quotes in his presentation, but certainly one of the things that we talked about was, about pushing for the steady state. So this, view that's been around for a while, but, trying to action that and implement that. And certainly that the goal is not more stuff, but better lives for everybody. As also you can see that, the shifting the conversation of the basic tenets of what is economics, not just sort of the financial aspect, but some of the other perspectives that Trevor had provided, but certainly that quadruple bottom line reporting. So human capital, social capital, in addition to some of the more financial aspects. You'll also see that, the strength of First Nations communities, we touched upon as well, and really the focus on the local aspects. Certainly, that sort of a shift in perspective from the short term, the immediate now, to the longer term view of what is socially and economically sustainable. And the last couple points in terms of, really linking to what we said earlier about, the very tangible things of, stuff and products, and having that sort of the COVID catalyst of, realizing that time is of the essence, family, nature, that sort of thing, and really having that perspective through this pandemic. And last but certainly not least, the language that we use around economics, around the focus of, what economics is, but realizing that the ecology aspects, the social, the human aspects is certainly needed to sustain, us moving forward. So that's a very quick overview. I'm hoping, my fellow workshop participants would also like to jump in.
Oh, that's great, thanks. It was interesting to note, incidentally, we had two people in our session, Roger Wheeler and Paula Diles, who both of them teach both within health and within business, and we need more of that too.
Definitely, we need more of that. Well, that sounds excellent, and I will go on next to ecological feminist approaches. My Gisla-san, and I believe Sandra was going to be the one to speak to it.
Yes, and Sam could put up the share screen.
There we go.
Yeah, so we had a really engaging discussion around the need or the aspect of intersectionality. And to me, that means holistic ways. And I'll sit closer to the mic. Sorry, I've got a cold. And that sustainability is part of that, allyship, and that we need to be careful of the language or be mindful of the language that we use. And that women have been fighting a good fight for a very long time against oppression, against disproportionate inequities, racism, fighting for the land, fighting for self-determination, fighting for rights. And it was amazing to hear some ladies share their experience of being on the front line, and doing sitting-ins with their children at offices. And the importance of, for me, that's the importance of voice, and that we support each other, we hold each other up, we're in this together. And yeah. And for me, it also I think of our grandmothers who've worked so hard to create a path for us, and their friends, that lived in town or far away in the canneries, and the importance of friendship and support in all of this, including, to me, that would be allyship, and how we can move things forward in these immense changes or immense challenges like missing Indigenous murdered women, the issue of the RCMP violence that we're seeing in our communities, the issue of racism, and how often our women hold up all of that in our families and our communities, and the need for care. And sometimes that means getting out on the land, getting close to water, being together, shutting things down, and working through those traumas that sometimes we've been holding for a long time, and how helpful that is. All right, that's it. Anyone in my group wants to add more?
Thank you, Sandra. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that was really excellent. I can't wait to watch that video too. Just a reminder to all volunteers, I forgot to say this earlier, make sure that your recordings are now off. I have the recording for this main session, so we don't want to have 10 different recordings going on. Let's move on to the next group, and I'm going to call the one that I went into, Rights in Nature and Right to a Healthy Environment.
All right, good afternoon all. I got nominated at the last minute to present. So my name's Allie, and thanks for having me here today. We had a really great conversation that looked at nature and its rights. And so we talked a lot about how we as members of communities can become involved. So some of the participants had expressed things that were going on in their communities and how stressful and disheartening it was, and how could we kind of become more involved. And we talked, what would be the role of lawyers and what would be the role of the citizens, and how municipalities can get together and get involved. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was this idea that climate change and the environment and environmental issues, for the most part, have often really been left to political will. And so as a result, we see that we don't have strong laws when it comes to environmental protection. And now we start to see the shift where it's starting to impact us, the humans. And earlier I was part of a group that talked about how humans kind of see themselves at the top of the hierarchy. And so now that us, at the top, we're getting affected, we're starting to recognize how important it is to protect our environment. And one of the things we spent a lot of time discussing was how we can use human rights and just rights in general, and how they can be applied to nature, and how it will have to be kind of contextual based on the situation. And one of the things that I found really interesting, and I didn't know, is that in New Zealand, several of their rivers, so the Whanganui River actually was given rights back in 2017 and granted legal person rights, which was quite interesting. And there was some discussion about how the Fraser River had gone to a public poll, and that there was quite some interest. About 70% of those who replied to the poll indicated that they would be in favor of doing this. So we have some work to do in Canada from that point of view, but that hopefully we can get there. And we discussed a little bit about the Blue Dot campaign. So if you don't know about it, I encourage you to check it out. And I just did a quick search and saw that only 174 communities have signed up for this. So maybe if you can look to see if your community's registered for that and has signed up. If not, maybe that's a really good way that we, the people, can get involved and really push the nature step forwards, and how we do all have a right to a healthy environment. But not only that, that nature itself has rights that we have long neglected. And I will open it up to the floor to the rest of the team just to make sure I didn't miss anything.
I guess you surmised it up pretty good. Yeah, it was a great conversation. I was really glad to be able to be a part of that. And so we will go on to the next group now. Let's check out exploring public health roles for a just and sustainable future. How did you guys do?
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Hopefully you can hear me now. We did great. I think we got off to a rocky start with technical issues that were my bad. I use Zoom and PowerPoint all the time, so I don't know why this had to happen to me at the beginning of our session, but it did. So thank you to my participants for being so patient with me. We had a talk about, we went over a few ideas about what a just and sustainable future looks like to all of us, what that means, and people came up with words like interconnectedness, community networks, intersectoral action and collaboration. And so I think we landed our dream big more on the how, but that's okay because the discussion was also about how we get there. And we looked at, I know I'm not going in order of the notes here, but we looked at some existing thinking around established public health rules to reduce inequities and to improve equity rather. And we thought about applying them to addressing the ecological determinants of health and noting that there was potential to grow these roles and grow the actions within these roles.
Can I just point out that the slide we have up is for food systems. It's not your slide.
Oh, thank you. That is a good point.
So, Aaron, would you stop sharing so that the systems people
might, Trevor, I think that the content of the slide is where it's at.
Yeah, I copied the wrong title. Yeah.
Okay,
good
thanks.
catch, and thank you for noting it, Trevor. So we looked at those 4 roles, but we looked at them in the context of a conversation about all of the issues, the social justice issues that we've heard about today through other previous presentations. We really built on that. So we talked about colonial violence. We talked about structural racism. We talked about unlearning the systems that relate to white supremacy. And we talked about how that's difficult within the systems that we all work within, but it's necessary. We also talked about how that kind of action is often not thought of as being the role of public health or the job of public health, similar to sometimes how acting on environmental health is not necessarily thought of as being that core public health work. I think the people who are in this session today and part of this public health in the Anthropocene would disagree, but it's not resourced as such. So on that point, we can probably agree that there's not the same level of mandate and dollars and time and resources put towards all of the issues as there is urgency to act on them. And so we looked at those 4 public health roles, and I'll just they're not up on the slide, but I'll just mention what they are. They're assessing and reporting, and we sort of talked about adapting that to assessing and reporting on massive ecological changes and their impact on health inequities, and also assessing and reporting on effective strategies to reduce these massive ecological changes and related inequities, because putting into the knowledge base what is working is really important. We talked about modifying and orienting systems and interventions to address ecological and structural determinants of health. And you'll see that reflected on the slide a little bit in some of what's written in looking at addressing structural racism and public health using what Irv called their capital, their current place in the spotlight and the ear of decision makers to bring inequities to light in the public sphere. And public health needing to disrupt oppression in different forms through their public health programming and in collaboration with others. And so that takes us to the 3rd role, which is about partnering and collaborating with others to build just and sustainable and resilient communities. And we've talked a lot about that today throughout many sessions, the need to work in collaboration across sectors, the need to look at whole of systems approaches, apply complexity lenses, and what we maybe layered onto that in this discussion is actually looking at applying critical race theory and intersectional lenses to the kind of collaborations we engage in and the kind of action we try and put forward. So that takes us to the 4th role, which has to do with participating in policy development. And we talked about how various different people on the call had different roles in policy development and had taken different roles in that within their personal and professional lives. And so we talked about how that's a necessary piece, even if you're not paid to do it through all of the different avenues that you can locally and through your public health associations rather, and also through other spheres of influence that can bring useful public health lenses to policy discussions, but also as public health specialists, to see it as our work to bring in those conversations about race and those conversations about structural inequity into those policy conversations, because they often are not reflected in the end policy statement. And part of that discussion, Cyril just mentioned this, had to do with effective community engagement as a promising practice for health equity, because and somebody used the term in our group, nothing about us without us, because of the importance of actually having voices with lived experience and people who these decisions are affecting to be informing the actual policy process. I think that's it. Anybody in my group have anything to add to the chat box or otherwise? Go for it.
Well, thank you very much. Another great conversation. It looks like we've got a lot of really good chat stuff going on in the chat box. So I encourage you guys to go check that out as well. And of course, as we're going through day 1 and into day 2, everything that we're learning, be sure to just think about it as we're going into the local change session 2 on the Friday afternoon, because we're going to be taking all the stuff that we've learned and we've discussed over the 2 days and really seeing what we can do to create concrete action in our local communities, and hopefully come up with some sort of action plan to start implementing these things that we've been talking about. So yeah, hopefully a lot of you guys will be able to join us on the Friday afternoon for that. I'm going to move over into, let's go with faith and spiritual issues, reverence for nature.
Thank you very much, Christina. So we've got a summary slide here with an additional graphic. I think, let me just say that I did check in with the group if anybody else was comfortable sharing the results, and people preferred that I go forward, which I appreciate and I'm happy to do. So I'm just wondering if we can move the graphic down on the slide so we can see the rest of the text. And thank you. Thanks very much. So I approached this topic with a great deal of humility, and I want to just say to people that I did do a video for this, which turned out to be like 20 minutes long, and it is virtually impossible to capture this very significant area and issues in such a short time. But I did focus on context, consciousness, connection, and began with a focus on creation. And where we landed in terms of this conversation, and I think if we could go up to the previous slide, we had basically a conversation about how we know what we know in the world, what are different ways of knowing, what are traditional experiences. I'm not sure what's happening with the screen share there. Okay, Aderonke, thank you so much, Aderonke. Appreciate you. I know it's not necessarily easy to jump back and forth between these things, but we reflected on a number of things, and has to do with the way that we're raised, with the sort of cultural norms that we're raised with, folks' experience of their connection to the natural world, and also people's experience of the trauma when we see destruction in the natural world, the kinds of trauma that we experience. We talked about how in many of the creation stories from around the world, humanity and the animals and the trees and plants were all connected, that we all spoke the same language and we could understand each other, and the elements like air, water. We talked about the importance of us being and integrated into the natural world, to see ourselves not as separate. And we talked about the source of some of that separateness, biblical references to dominion. We also talked about the economic drivers and the ways that we are separated from nature as we urbanize, and with the various different economic systems that are influencing the destruction of the natural world. And let me just say that we talked about the concepts of health associated with being in nature, and examples of forest bathing, studies and measures that were taken to understand how people are made healthier by their interaction with the natural world. And so in this instance, I think there's just so much to share, but we, in terms of what we can do as a collective, and people did share personal stories of their experience of contact with nature. People shared stories and experiences in ceremony and ways of knowing about being part of the world. And so it was a very touching and intimate conversation, actually, and I was very grateful for the folks who participated. So what can we do collectively? I think came up in a couple of different ways, that expressing more mindfulness about the way we are collectively in the world would be helpful, that there are ways forward that appreciate and understand the role of animals and trees and plants. We talked about Finhorn, and we talked about various traditions and the relationship between humanity and different species. And that in the practice, in an economy of kindness, we would be more respectful of the lives of the animals here and the carbon producing, the plants, pardon me, that make it possible for us to breathe. We talked about the importance of learning from nature. And one of the things that I noted, not in my presentation, but when I was preparing for this, was, you know, when I went into the hospital, I went into labor for my son, and most of the women there had never seen a live birth before. They'd had no experience of I didn't have any anxiety because I was born on a farm and I saw animals being born all the time, and I was very relaxed about it. But most of them were terrified because they were so far from their natural roots. And so I, you know, anyway, I won't get into the business of childbirth, which is a whole nother matter in terms of the natural world and our place in it. But I did want to express that the sense of being isolated from nature, of being frightened by nature, of being separate from nature, is something that we need to address more collectively. Also, that we need to consider our relationship to food systems, and this has come up over and over again in our conversations, not just what we eat and how agri-systems influence what we eat, but they also influence our experience of being part of the natural world. So I'm sure I haven't done justice to the fullness of our conversation, but I did want to close by saying that the connectedness that we felt in our session was part of being open and authentic about our experiences on an emotional level in terms of our relationship to Earth. And that when, you know, nature never did betray the heart that loved her. And so I think that when we can move forward and care for the Earth, and for self-care is part of that process. So thank you so much. We are not separate from Gaia, we're part of her.
Awesome. Thanks very much,
Any other comments?
More comments? Okay, we are going to move on to, we've got 2 more sessions left and we're technically at time. So thank you everybody for staying on, and I will pass it off to Indigenous Approaches to Sustainability, and then we'll finish it off right away with the work of the Cascade Institute. So first off, yep, perfect.
Okay, hi, this is Fleur. We had a very good conversation in Indigenous Approaches to Sustainability. One of the first things that we talked about, and we talked about this for quite a while, was around the importance of stories. We get so much quantitative data, but it's really stories that sort of stay with us, and they better reflect people's experience, and they probably move people a lot more. We talked about the importance of stories in evaluation, and I think Dr. Waters shared a story about making a presentation and then someone coming up to her afterwards and saying, oh, it was very interesting. It was all a bunch of squiggles, because I guess her slides had like a lot of quantitative data. And really, she was saying how important it was to also collect that qualitative data, because it resonates more with people, especially in the kinds of spaces that we need to be in, where we're talking to people who are not academics and who are not used to dealing with this kind of quantitative data that we're more interested, or that we're often collecting and sharing. We also talked about timelines and perspectives, that some things can happen quite quickly and some things will happen much more slowly, and that to be sort of expecting and respectful of that. We talked about legitimizing multiple worldviews and having, you know, different people with different perspectives at the decision-making tables. We learned quite a bit about this new TRIP Act in BC, which will, through legislation, will bring people to these decision-making tables. And we also talked about having multiple Indigenous perspectives, not having one particular person, you know, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and maybe other Indigenous people from across the country or across the world. At that table, you need multiple people to come to be there, to have multiple perspectives. And then I just sort of made a little plug at the end, because I'm involved with these new CIHR networks for Indigenous health research that were recently established. And so there are networks across Canada, so there's 9 of them, and people might want to connect with them. They might not have heard of them yet, because they really launched during the pandemic, so it's been hard to get much traction around them. But there are Indigenous academics from across the country and people and knowledge users quite interested in some of this work, and I know some people here already are aware of these, and we've been working with them. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So we'll go to last but definitely not least, the work of the Cascade Institute.
Oh, thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm hoping everybody's seeing my screen. We had our session with Thomas Homer Dixon, and we got into a great discussion about understanding cultural transformation and evolution. And certainly starting throughout our history, we've more or less looked at ourselves and understood ourselves as progress has gone on under the illusion of control and the ability to tweak a system in certain circumstances and events, you know, under controlled experiments, and how we can create and manipulate, pardon me, our environments. However, you know, as we go through this stage in our history, we're realizing that there are limits on predictability, which has undermined our trust in experts. And since there's limits in predictability, you know, there's questions being raised, and a different perspective really coming to light as to, you know, our traditional faith in our experts and our progress as a civilization. Well, if you can't really provide us with the predictability that we're looking for, then there's a turning their backs or turning our backs on the expertise that we would otherwise have. I think, do I have that right, Thomas Homer Dixon? Are you there? Okay. So how we really have to build on this is finding ways to continue that trust and build on the trust. Bonnie Henry, for example, has communicated the limits of knowledge in a way that has not destroyed trust. And in terms of how that's happened and been supported is political leaders have more or less stepped aside, allowed the experts have the podium, and they've backed what the experts have said with administrative and political support. And you know, there's a lot of what has happened behind the scenes may not be communicated, but BC has certainly had a different approach and is way ahead of the game in terms of how they are engaging people, how they are engaging the public, and still providing that pardon me, environmental expertise, and in a way that we continue to trust our experts, and certainly in terms of the pandemic, that has certainly been evident in the way we've managed to flatten the curve and pull together while you know, recognizing the trust is there. Now there's lots of it was a very interesting discussion. Certainly we discussed systems frameworks. Biology is a systems oriented framework. Physics a little less so in the way that it is taught. You know, there needs to be more in terms of a systems framework applied to the sciences and the way we teach things and the way we approach things in our society. Overall, I think it's been a great discussion. I will leave the floor open to my fellow people who were participating in the discussion to add their comments as well.
Hi, it's Michael here. Thank you, Chris, for that. I just wanted to identify one little typo on the last point, number 6, okay. Ontological shift. It's deep relationalism and not rationalism. So just for the record, the discussion was more about how if we can transform the way in which we think about things such that identity is rooted in a thing's being is related to its connections rather than just to its essential elements inside or whatever.
Yep.
So just relationalism, not rationalism. Thanks.
Well, that's fantastic, because I was wondering